The first time Lady Evelyn Harrow stood alone in the middle of a ballroom, as whispers spread around her. She understood what humiliation truly felt like. Music drifted through the golden hall of Blackthorn Manor, candle light shimmered against crystal chandeliers, silk gowns brushed across polished marble floors, and yet she stood motionless near the staircase, while guests pretended not to stare. The Duke still keeps the late fiancée's portrait above the hearth. I heard he refused to remove her roses from the West Garden. Then why marry another woman at all? Evelyn kept her back straight. She had practiced that expression for months, calm, graceful, untouched, but humiliation had a strange way of settling beneath the skin. At the far end of the ballroom stood her husband, Duke Adrian Ashcombe, tall, reserved, untouchably composed. Women still admired him in silence, despite the grief that had hollowed him over the past 3 years. He rarely smiled, rarely lingered in conversation, yet the entire room shifted around him like iron drawn toward a magnet. He was speaking to several ministers now, dressed in black, despite the warmth of spring. He had not looked at Evelyn once since they arrived, not once. The orchestra began another waltz around her. Couples moved gracefully into the center of the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes for only a moment. That was when she heard it, poor thing, softly spoken, almost pitying. She truly believed marriage would make him love her. A quiet ache spread through her chest, not because the woman was cruel, because she was right. 3 months earlier, Evelyn had entered this marriage, believing patience could soften grief. She believed kindness mattered. She believed devotion over time might become affection. Instead, she had become a shadow moving quietly through Blackthorn Manor, while her husband remained emotionally somewhere beside another woman's grave, the late Lady Isabella, beautiful, charming, beloved, dead before her wedding day. Evelyn had spent years hearing stories about her, long before she became Duchess of Ashcombe. Everyone spoke of Isabella as though she had been sunlight itself, and Adrian still carried her memory like a wound he refused to let heal. At last his gaze lifted across the ballroom. For one terrible second, Evelyn thought he might finally walk toward her. Instead, his eyes shifted past her shoulder, toward Isabella's portrait hanging above the marble fireplace. Even now, even tonight, a small silence formed inside Evelyn, then very small but dangerous. Later that evening, rain began falling over the estate. The carriage ride home was painfully quiet. Water streamed down the windows, while lantern light flickered across Adrian's sharp profile. Evelyn folded her hands together tightly. "You should not have left me standing alone so long tonight," she said softly. The words surprised even her. Adrian did not immediately answer. "I was occupied." "You were occupied the entire evening." His jaw tightened slightly. "You understand, these gatherings are political. I understand humiliation." The carriage fell silent again. She immediately regretted speaking, not because she was wrong, because she hated sounding wounded. Adrian finally turned toward her, his expression softened for only a moment. "You were treated respectfully." Look toward the rain-streaked glass respectfully. The word hurt more than cruelty because respect was cold. Respect never reached for her hand. Respect never noticed when she stopped smiling. Respect never loved her. When they returned to Blackthorn Manor, Adrian moved toward his study as he always did after social events, but tonight Evelyn quietly spoke before he disappeared behind the doors. "Did you ever truly wish to marry me?" He stopped. The candle light flickered across his shoulders for several seconds. He said nothing at all. Then finally, "You deserved stability after your father's debts ruined your family, not affection, not desire, not happiness, stability." Evelyn smiled faintly, a smile that looked almost peaceful. "That was not my question." For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed Adrian's face, but she was already turning away, and somehow that unsettled him far more than tears would have. Upstairs, Evelyn stood alone beside her bedroom window, while rain covered the gardens below. Her marriage suddenly felt very quiet, very long, and somewhere deep beneath her sadness, something began slowly changing. Not anger, not resentment, something colder, the beginning of emotional surrender. And downstairs, for reasons he could not explain, Duke Adrian Ashcombe remained awake long after midnight, thinking about the look on his wife's face when she stopped waiting for his answer. The following weeks passed beneath gray skies and careful silence. Evelyn continued performing every duty expected of a duchess with perfect grace. She hosted dinners, managed servants, oversaw charity accounts, smiled during public appearances. No one outside the marriage noticed the difference, but Adrian noticed it immediately. She no longer waited for him. It revealed itself in small ways. First, at breakfast, she stopped glancing toward the doorway when he entered. During carriage rides, she looked out the window instead of attempting conversation. At night, she no longer lingered in the library, hoping he might join her beside the fire. The warmth she once carried around him had quietly disappeared, and Blackthorn Manor suddenly felt colder because of it. One afternoon, Adrian returned unexpectedly early from Parliament. Rain clouds gathered over the estate, while servants hurried through corridors with lit candles. He entered the music room and paused. Evelyn sat beside the piano near the windows, not playing, simply reading. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore stood nearby, speaking softly with her. Adrian recognized him immediately, a respected physician, intelligent, well-liked, far too observant. Evelyn looked up first. "You returned early." Her voice was calm, gentle, but distant. Nathaniel smiled politely. "Your Grace," Adrian nodded once. "What brings you here?" Nathaniel answered easily. "The Duchess arranged additional funding for the winter clinics outside the city." Adrian's eyes shifted toward Evelyn. "You handled this, was no need to trouble you." The words were harmless, yet something sharp moved unexpectedly through him. Nathaniel continued speaking with Evelyn about village conditions, while Adrian stood listening in uncomfortable silence. She looked different lately, not physically, emotionally. There was new steadiness in her voice, a quiet confidence, as though she had stopped fearing disappointment, and somehow that unsettled him deeply. When Nathaniel finally departed, Adrian remained near the doorway. "You seemed quite comfortable with him." Evelyn closed her book slowly. "He speaks to me." Answer struck harder than he expected. Adrian frowned. "That was unnecessary." "No, merely honest." Rain tapped softly against the windows for a long moment. Neither spoke. Then Adrian noticed something strange. The vase beside the piano no longer held white roses, Isabella's roses. Evelyn had replaced them with winter lily simple flowers, elegant, alive. "You changed the flowers," he said quietly. "Yes, you always preferred the roses, I think," Evelyn replied softly. "I simply grew tired of mourning a woman I never met." Adrian's expression hardened instantly. "That is unfair." Perhaps she stood gracefully and moved toward the door, but before leaving, she paused beside him. "For 3 months. I tried very hard to become someone this house could love." Her eyes lifted toward his then, steady, vulnerable, tired. "I do not think I wish to try any more." That night, Adrian found himself standing alone inside the West Garden. The roses Isabella once loved bloomed beneath silver rain. For years he believed grief honored love, that refusing happiness somehow proved devotion. But now another woman's silence haunted him more than memories ever had. Inside the manor, Evelyn prepared for bed alone, and for the first time since their marriage, she did not cry after extinguishing the candles, which frightened Adrian far more than tears ever could. Summer arrived slowly over London. The social season filled every ballroom with music, gossip, and carefully disguised cruelty, and Evelyn became the subject of all three. She removed Isabella's roses. She refuses to wear the sapphire necklace the late fiancé once admired. I heard the Duke barely speaks to her now. Rumors spread elegantly through aristocratic society like perfume through silk, never loud, never direct, always poisonous. At the Carlisle ball, Evelyn felt the whispers following her before she even entered the room. Women lowered their voices, men watched curiously. The orchestra played beneath glittering chandeliers, while heat pressed softly against crowded walls. Adrian remained across the ballroom, discussing trade negotiations, distant again, always distant when she needed him most. Then Lady Margaret Carlisle approached with a smile too polished to be sincere. "Dear Duchess," she said warmly, "you must forgive society's fascination." People simply adored Lady Isabella. The nearby women fell silent, watching, waiting. Evelyn kept her composure, "I understand," tilted her head gently, still replacing her roses, so quickly did seem rather cold. Humiliation arrived quietly, not dramatic, not loud, far worse. Several guests pretended not to listen. Evelyn felt heat rise beneath her skin, and then she changed the flowers because I neglected to notice. My wife heard them. The entire circle turned. Adrian stood behind her, tall, controlled, dangerous. Silence swept through the group. Margaret blinked in surprise. "Your Grace, I meant no offense. I believe you did." His voice remained calm, which somehow made it harsher. Evelyn stared at him in shock. It was the first time he had publicly defended her ever. Margaret quickly excused herself. The others dispersed just as fast, but the damage lingered. Adrian finally looked down at Evelyn. "You should have informed me this was happening." A faint laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "You have spent months avoiding seeing what was directly before you." Something painful flickered behind his eyes. For one brief moment, he looked almost ashamed. The orchestra began another waltz. Couples drifted elegantly toward the dance floor. Adrian hesitated, then quietly, "Dance with me." Evelyn froze. It should not have mattered so much. One dance, one simple request, and yet her chest tightened painfully, because once months ago she would have treasured this moment. Now she only felt tired. Still, she placed her hand in his. The ballroom blurred around them as he guided her into the waltz. Adrian danced beautifully, controlled, precise, effortlessly commanding, but tonight his hand lingered slightly firmer against hers. His gaze remained on her face instead of wandering elsewhere, and Evelyn hated how much she still noticed these things. "You defended me," she said quietly. "I should have sooner." Yes. No bitterness, just truth. The honesty unsettled him. "You believe I have failed." You looked up at him slowly. "I believe you never truly allowed me into your life." The words landed heavily between them. Adrian's hand tightened subtly at her waist. Around them, candle light shimmered across spinning couples. "You think I do not care for you." "I think," she whispered, "you care only after losing something." His breath caught slightly for several seconds. He could not answer because somewhere deep inside himself, Adrian feared she might be right. When the dance ended, several noblemen immediately approached Evelyn. One of them was Nathaniel Whitmore. He smiled warmly. "Your Grace, may I request the next dance?" Adrian's jaw tightened instantly. Evelyn noticed. For the first time since their marriage, she truly noticed jealousy in her husband's eyes, and something dangerous shifted between them because of it. Adrian could not sleep after the Carlisle ball. He remained inside his study while dawn slowly brightened the windows. Nathaniel Whitmore's hand against Evelyn's waist during the dance replayed endlessly in his mind. The way she smiled faintly at the physician, the way she looked calmer beside another man than she ever looked beside her husband. Jealousy was unfamiliar to Adrian. He disliked how quickly it consumed him. Several days later, Evelyn traveled into the countryside to inspect one of the duchy's orphan schools. Normally, Adrian would not have noticed her absence until dinner. Instead, he found himself repeatedly glancing toward the clock. By evening, a violent storm swept across the roads. Rain battered the manor windows. Thunder rolled through the hills, and when Evelyn's carriage still had not returned by nightfall, something cold settled in Adrian's chest. "Prepare horses," he ordered immediately. Servants exchanged surprised glances. "Your Grace, the roads are dangerous." Now, hours later, Adrian found the broken carriage near the forest road. One wheel had collapsed in the mud. Lantern light flickered through heavy rain. Evelyn stood beneath a tree beside the frightened driver, soaked by the storm despite her cloak. The moment Adrian stepped from his horse, relief crossed her face so quickly it almost hurt him. "You came yourself." The question carried genuine surprise. Adrian removed his coat and wrapped it firmly around her shoulders. "You could have been injured. I am unharmed." Her hands were trembling from cold. Without thinking, Adrian touched her cheek gently. Rain water glistened against her skin. For one suspended moment, the storm disappeared around them. Evelyn looked at him differently, then not hopeful, not pleading, only startled, as though she had forgotten he was capable of tenderness. That realization wounded him unexpectedly during the carriage ride home. Thunder echoed outside, while lantern light swayed softly across the dark interior. Evelyn held his coat tightly around herself. "You should not have ridden through weather like this. You mattered more than the weather." The words escaped before he fully considered them. Silence followed, heavy, dangerous. Evelyn turned toward the window, and Adrian realized with quiet panic that she no longer knew what to do with his affection because he had offered it too late. Back at the manor, servants hurried to prepare fires and warm tea. As Evelyn climbed the staircase, she suddenly swayed from exhaustion. Adrian caught her immediately, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. Her breath caught softly. "You're freezing," he murmured. "I am merely tired." She looked pale beneath candlelight. Adrian escorted her personally to her chambers, another first. When the maid departed briefly for dry blankets, an uneasy silence filled the room. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Evelyn sat near the fire, wrapped in warmth, while Adrian remained standing nearby, watching her, unable to stop watching her. "You frightened me tonight," he admitted quietly. Evelyn looked up slowly. No one had ever heard the Duke of Ashcombe sound uncertain before. "You hid your feelings very well these past months." The words were soft, not cruel, which somehow made them devastating. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly. Then finally, "I did not realize how much space you occupied in my life until the thought of losing you." Emotion flickered across her face, longing, pain, hope. She clearly tried to suppress, and Adrian suddenly hated himself for placing that hope there again, because he still did not fully understand his own heart, but he knew one terrifying truth now. The silence inside Blackthorn Manor no longer felt peaceful without Evelyn. It felt unbearable. 3 weeks later, the royal garden banquet changed everything. Hundreds of guests gathered beneath lanternlit terraces overlooking the river. Music drifted through warm evening air. Evelyn wore silver silk tonight, simple, elegant, and impossible for Adrian not to notice. Men noticed too many throughout the evening. Noblemen continuously sought her company. She laughed more easily lately, not because she was happier, because she no longer expected anything, and that frightened Adrian deeply. Then came the rumor, cruel, sudden, explosive. Lady Beatrice Norwood mentioned it loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. "They say the Duchess intends to remove Lady Isabella's memorial entirely from Blackthorn Manor." The terrace fell silent, eyes turned immediately toward Evelyn. "She wishes to erase her completely." Accusation spread through nearby guests within seconds. Adrian saw the color drain slightly from Evelyn's face, not because the rumor was true, because she was exhausted from endlessly defending herself against a dead woman's memory. Beatrice continued smoothly. "Surely such actions are rather disrespectful." Then came the moment that changed everything. Adrian hesitated only briefly, but publicly long enough. The silence became its own answer. Evelyn looked at him, just one look, no anger, no tears, only quiet heartbreak, and Adrian realized too late what his hesitation had done. She lowered her gaze gracefully. "I believe the evening air has become cold." Then she walked away alone. The whispers exploded instantly. Adrian moved after her at once, but Nathaniel Whitmore reached her first near the staircase garden. Adrian stopped several feet away, unseen. Nathaniel removed his coat gently around Evelyn's shoulders. "You should not remain here alone," laughed softly. A broken sound. "I'm quite practiced at loneliness." Adrian felt those words like a blade. Nathaniel's expression softened painfully. "He does not deserve your loyalty." Look toward the distant lights of the ballroom. "You misunderstand. I stopped expecting love from him some time ago." Adrian went completely still, stopped expecting love. The words hollowed something inside him. Nathaniel touched her hand carefully, then leave. She closed her eyes briefly. "I do not know if I still belong anywhere." Adrian stepped backward into shadow before either saw him for the first time in years. Genuine fear entered his chest, not fear of scandal, not fear of grief, fear of losing her completely. That night, Evelyn packed several books into a small traveling case, not because she planned to leave immediately, but because for the first time she was imagining life beyond Blackthorn Manor. And downstairs Adrian sat alone beside the fire. Realizing he had become the very source of pain, he once promised himself he would never cause another person again. The letters were discovered accidentally. A locked cedar box hidden behind old ledgers in the west study. Adrian nearly ignored it entirely until he noticed Isabella's handwriting. His pulse slowed instantly. For years he had preserved every memory of her like sacred relics. With careful hands he opened the box. Inside lay dozens of letters tied with faded ribbon, some addressed to him, others unfinished, and one addressed to Evelyn. Adrian frowned slowly. He unfolded it. Then the world around him seemed to disappear. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Adrian has likely buried himself inside grief the way he always does when he cannot bear pain. You once asked me whether I loved him enough to marry him on a mostly. The truth is, I cared for him deeply, but not in the way he deserved. You looked at him differently. You always did, gentler, steadier. Please stay beside him when I no longer can. He will become cold after my death, perhaps unbearable, but beneath that grief is a man terrified of being abandoned. Do not let him destroy himself, mourning someone who could never love him properly. Adrian stopped breathing. Another letter slipped from the box, then another, each one revealing truths he never imagined. Isabella had admired him, respected him, but her heart had belonged elsewhere long before her death. Autumn arrived early that year. Cold winds swept through Blackthorn Manor while preparations for possible war unsettled the kingdom. Adrian buried himself in political affairs during the day. But every evening he searched for Evelyn, not out of duty anymore need, and she was slipping further away from him, not cruelly, quietly. She spent more time outside the manor now, visiting schools, hospitals, villages. People loved her there, not because she was a duchess, because she listened. One afternoon, Adrian arrived unexpectedly at the Riverside Orphan School. Children surrounded Evelyn beneath golden trees. She laughed softly while helping a little girl arrange flowers inside cracked jars. The sight struck him motionless. She looked peaceful away from him. That realization hurt more than jealousy ever had. A young boy tugged Evelyn's sleeve suddenly. "Will you leave for the coast soon, Your Grace?" Adrian's stomach tightened instantly. Evelyn smiled gently. "Perhaps." Child frowned sadly. "We will miss you." Adrian stepped forward before thinking. "Leave." Evelyn turned slowly, surprise crossed her face. The children quickly scattered elsewhere, sensing tension. Adrian approached her beneath the fading autumn light. "You intend to leave Blackthorn for a time. For how long, I do not know." Answer chilled him completely. Adrian lowered his voice. "You planned this without telling me. You never noticed enough to ask." Pain flashed sharply across his expression. Evelyn immediately regretted the words. Not because they were false, because hurting him no longer satisfied her. She was simply tired. Adrian looked toward the river briefly before speaking again. "I have been trying. I know." "Then why do you still look at me as though I am already too late?" The vulnerability in his voice startled her. Evelyn's eyes softened unwillingly. Because this was no longer the cold, distant duke she married. This was a man unraveling quietly. You cannot suddenly discover affection after months of neglect and expect everything to heal instantly. I know. His honesty made the moment worse. Adrian stepped closer. Wind moved through the trees around them. "I read every letter again," he said softly, "and all I could think about was you." Evelyn's breath trembled faintly. "You should not say things you may regret later." "I regret nearly everything already." Settled between them, heavy with longing. Then Adrian spoke the words he had feared for months. "I cannot bear the thought of this house without you." Emotion flickered dangerously in Evelyn's eyes. Because once, hearing those words would have meant everything. Now she no longer knew if she could trust them. And Adrian saw that uncertainty, saw the distance he created himself. For the first time in his life, powerlessness truly terrified him. That evening he found Evelyn's packed traveling cases beside her chamber door. And he realized with cold panic that love arriving late still carried the risk of loss. The morning Evelyn planned to leave Blackthorn Manor, snow began falling quietly across the estate. White covered the gardens, the fountains, the frozen rose paths Isabella once loved. Servants moved silently through the halls, sensing tension none dared mention aloud. Evelyn stood near the entrance wearing a dark blue traveling cloak, calm, too calm. Her carriage waited outside. Adrian descended the staircase just as the footman opened the doors. For one terrible second, he imagined arriving moments too late. Evelyn. She turned slowly. The sight of him stopped her breath slightly. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, as though he had not slept at all, which he had not. Adrian crossed the hall toward her. Snowlight spilled softly through tall windows. "You truly intended to leave without seeing me. You were in Parliament." "I abandoned Parliament." Answer startled her. Adrian rarely abandoned duty for anything. He stopped before her, close enough now to see the faint sadness beneath her composure. "I know apologies cannot repair what I did," he said quietly, "but I cannot allow you to believe you were unloved." Emotion tightened painfully inside Evelyn's chest. "Adrian, no, please." Voice almost broke then. The powerful Duke of Ashcombe looked suddenly vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "For months I treated grief like loyalty. I worshipped memory because memory could not disappoint me. Snow drifted softly beyond the windows. While I mourned a woman who never truly loved me. His eyes held hers completely now. I neglected the woman who did. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes instantly, not dramatic tears, the quiet kind born from exhaustion and longing. Adrian stepped closer carefully. As soon as you stopped loving me openly, I finally understood how desperately I needed you. A painful laugh escaped her. You noticed me only when I began disappearing. Yes. Honesty shattered her defenses more than excuses would have. Adrian reached for her hand slowly. Giving her time to pull away, she did not. His fingers closed around hers gently, warmly. I do not deserve another chance, he whispered. But if there is even the smallest part of you willing to remain, I will spend the rest of my life proving your love was not wasted on me. Emotion trembled across Evelyn's face, years of loneliness, hope, humiliation, tenderness, all meeting at once. You hurt me deeply, she admitted softly. His eyes closed briefly. I know. Part of me still fears becoming invisible beside you again. Adrian lifted her hand carefully against his chest. You never were invisible to me. She looked at him sadly. I was. The truth of it nearly destroyed him. Then slowly Adrian lowered himself onto one knee before her. The servants froze silently across the hall. No one had ever seen the Duke of Ashcombe kneel for anyone. His voice shook slightly. I loved you too late, but I love you completely now. Slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. Because every lonely part of her had waited so long to hear those words, too long. And yet they were finally real. Adrian looked up at her with raw fear in his eyes, not fear of pride, fear of losing her. I cannot promise perfection, he whispered. But I swear you will never question your place beside me again. Silence that followed felt endless. Then slowly, very slowly, Evelyn set down her gloves and touched his face gently. The smallest breath left Adrian's chest. Relief, wonder, love. I do not know how to stop loving you, she confessed quietly. Emotion overtook him completely then. He rose quickly and pulled her carefully into his arms, not possessive, protective. As though holding something precious he nearly lost forever. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Blackthorn Manor. And for the first time since their marriage, the house no longer felt haunted by memory. It felt alive. Weeks later, the west garden bloomed again beneath winter sunlight. But now white roses grew beside winter lilies, past and present together, not competing, healing. And inside the manor, laughter slowly replaced silence. Adrian sought Evelyn instinctively in every room now. During dinners, his eyes found her first. During crowded gatherings, his hand rested naturally against her back. At night they spoke for hours beside the fire while snow covered the windows beyond. Not because loneliness demanded it, because love finally did. And sometimes, when Evelyn caught Adrian watching her with quiet devotion across candle-lit rooms, she still felt a faint ache for the years they lost. But then he would reach for her hand without hesitation, as though afraid even now she might disappear. And she would realize something softly beautiful. The cold, distant Duke who once mourned the wrong woman had finally learned where his heart truly belonged, with the wife who waited far too long to be loved. Story idea. The Duke's wife who waited too long. A shy noblewoman marries a grieving Duke whose former fiancé died tragically before their wedding. Though kind, the Duke remains emotionally frozen, treating his new wife more like a respectful guest than someone he loves. Determined to earn his affection, she quietly supports him through political crises, cruel aristocratic gossip, and endless comparisons to the dead woman. But when false rumors accuse her of trying to erase the late fiancé's memory, the Duke fails to defend her publicly, causing the kingdom to despise her. Heartbroken, she finally gives up trying to be loved and emotionally withdraws from the marriage. The sudden absence of her warmth slowly destroys the Duke's carefully controlled world. Jealousy consumes him when another nobleman begins openly admiring her kindness and intelligence, the same qualities he ignored for years. Then comes the devastating twist. The Duke discovers his late fiancé's final letters, revealing she never truly loved him and had begged his future wife to protect him from his self-destructive grief after her death. The heroine had known this all along and sacrificed her own happiness to honor a dying woman's wish. As war approaches and she decides to leave the duchy permanently, the Duke must finally confront the terrifying possibility that the woman who loved him most no longer does.